If you were a tech investor in 1995, you didn't care about Microsoft. You cared about a company called Netscape was the Google of the 90s. They were the fastest-growing software company in history. Their product, the Netscape Navigator, wasn't just a web browser. It was the internet. For 90% of people online, the blue N logo was the only way to access the World Wide Web. They were young, they were cool, and they had just pulled off the most successful IPO in history, turning their 24-year-old founder, Marc Andreessen, into a multimillionaire overnight. But in Redmond, Washington, a very different scene was playing out. Bill Gates, the richest man in the world, had just realized he had made a colossal mistake. For years, he had ignored the internet, calling it a fad. But now, seeing Netscape's valuation skyrocket, he realized that the browser wasn't just an app. It was a threat. If the browser became the platform where everyone ran their software, nobody would need Windows anymore. Netscape wasn't just competing for users, they were threatening to make Microsoft irrelevant. What followed was the most brutal corporate war in history. A war fought not with bullets, but with code, lawyers, and ruthless business tactics. Microsoft didn't just want to compete with Netscape. They wanted to erase them from existence. They wanted to cut off their air supply. This is the story of how Microsoft used its monopoly to destroy its biggest rival, how they almost got broken up by the US government for it, and how, ironically, their victory planted the seeds for their own stagnation. To understand why Microsoft was so terrified, you have to understand what computing was like before 1995. If you wanted to write a document, you bought Microsoft Word. If you wanted to crunch numbers, you bought Microsoft Excel. All this software ran on Windows. Windows was the toll booth. If you wanted to use a computer, you had to pay Bill Gates. This is what we call a platform monopoly. But Netscape proposed something different. They said, the operating system doesn't matter. Marc Andreessen famously said that Windows would become just a poorly debugged set of device drivers. In Netscape's vision, you would boot up your computer, open the browser, and do everything there. Your email, your news, your banking, your games all inside Net. If that happened, it wouldn't matter if you were using Windows, Mac, or Linux. The browser would become the new operating system. And since Microsoft made all its money selling Windows, this was an existential threat. So, on December 7th, 1995, Pearl Harbor Day, Bill Gates called his generals to a meeting. He wrote a famous memo titled The Internet Tidal Wave. He declared that from that day forward, the internet was priority number one for Microsoft. Every single product, every single team, every single line of code had to be focused on the web. The sleeping giant had woken up. Microsoft had a problem. Netscape had a massive head start. Their browser was better, faster, and everyone was already using it. Microsoft's first attempt, Internet Explorer 1.0, was a joke. It was just a licensed copy of an old browser called Mosaic, and it was terrible. But Microsoft had something Netscape didn't: infinite money and infinite manpower. They put hundreds of engineers on the project. They worked around the clock. By the time they released Internet Explorer 3.0, it was decent, not great, but usable. But being usable isn't enough to kill a market leader. You need leverage, and Microsoft had the ultimate leverage. They owned the desktop. This is where the tactics turned from competitive to predatory. Microsoft went to the computer manufacturers Compaq HP, Gateway, and gave them an ultimatum. They said, if you want to sell computers with Windows, which you have to, because nobody buys computers without Windows, you must include Internet Explorer pre-installed on the desktop. And you are forbidden from installing Netscape. Think about that. If you bought a new PC, Internet Explorer was already there. Why would you go to a store, buy a box with Netscape for $49? Yes, browsers used to cost money. Drive home and install it when the Blue E was already on your screen for free. Before we continue dissecting how this monopoly tactic destroyed innovation for a decade, if you enjoy deep dives into the history of how the tech industry really works, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. We don't just cover code, we cover the wars that shaped the code. Netscape was panicking. Their revenue model depended on selling the browser. Microsoft just made the browser free. Netscape tried to pivot to selling server software, but Microsoft gave away their server software for free too. It was a war of attrition. Microsoft was bleeding money on Internet Explorer, hundreds of millions of dollars a year, but they didn't care. They could subsidize it with profits from Windows. Netscape, a startup, couldn't compete with free. Then came the extinguish phase. Microsoft started adding proprietary features to HTML. They created ActiveX and special tags that only worked in Internet Explorer. Web developers, lazy by nature, started building sites that said best viewed in Internet Explorer. If you tried to open them in Netscape, they looked broken. The web, which was supposed to be an open standard, was fracturing. Microsoft was winning. By 1998, Netscape's market share had collapsed. The company was sold to AOL for pennies on the dollar. The war was over. Microsoft had won. But you can't just bully your way to total dominance without attracting attention. The tactics Microsoft used, bundling, exclusionary contracts, and predatory pricing, caught the eye of the U.S. Department of Justice. In 1998, the DOJ sued Microsoft for antitrust violations. The trial was a media circus. It was the trial of the century. The government argued that Microsoft was an illegal monopoly that was stifling innovation. They had emails, smoking gun emails, where Microsoft executives talked about cutting off Netscape SR supply and crushing them. Bill Gates, usually seen as a genius nerd, appeared in deposition tapes, looking arrogant, combative, and evasive. He argued over the definition of the word is. It was a PR disaster. The judge ruled against Microsoft. He ordered that the company be broken up into two separate entities, one for Windows and one for software applications. It was the nuclear option. Microsoft appealed, and eventually, after a change in administration in the White House, they settled for a much lighter punishment. They weren't broken up, they just had to share some APIs and stop the exclusive contracts. Technically, Microsoft survived, but the trial changed them. It traumatized the company. For the next decade, Microsoft became cautious. They were terrified of the government. This caution caused them to miss the next big waves. They were too slow on search, Google won. They were too slow on mobile, Apple and Android won. They were too slow on social, Facebook won. The browser war victory cost them their agility. Here is the twist ending that nobody saw coming. When Netscape was dying, in a final act of desperation and defiance, they did something radical. They took their source code, the secret recipe of the Navigator, and they released it to the public. They made it open source. They created a project called Mozilla. For years, the Mozilla project was a mess. The code was bloated and hard to work with, but a group of passionate volunteers kept rewriting it, stripping it down, and making it faster. Out of the ashes of Netscape, a new browser was born. They called it Phoenix at first, then Firebird, and finally, Firefox. Firefox launched in 2004. It was everything Internet Explorer wasn't, i.e. had become stagnant. Since Microsoft had no competition, they stopped improving it. IE 6 was a security nightmare, full of bugs and Firefox introduced tabs, pop-up blocking, and speed. Users flocked to it. The monopoly began to crack. And then, in 2008, Google, tired of Microsoft's dominance, launched Chrome. Chrome was built on the philosophy that the browser should be the operating system, exactly what Netscape envisioned 15 years earlier. Chrome won. Today, Internet Explorer is dead. Microsoft Edge is now built on Chromium, the engine created by Google. The browser wars teach us a fundamental lesson about the tech industry. Monopolies are powerful, but they are not eternal. Microsoft used its leverage to kill Netscape, but in doing so, they galvanized the open source movement that eventually destroyed their browser dominance. They tried to kill the web to save Windows, but the web won. Today, nobody cares what operating system you use. You live in the browser. You use Google Docs, Figma, Figma Slack, and VS Code inside the browser. Netscape lost the battle, but they won the war. Marc Andreessen's vision came true. The browser became the OS. This cycle is happening again right now. We see Apple fighting Epic Games over the App Store. We see Google fighting the DOJ over search. We see NVIDIA fighting for dominance in AI chips. The players change, the technology changes, but the war for the platform remains the same. If you are a developer, you need to understand this history. You need to understand that the tools you use, VS Code, React, Chromium, are not just neutral technologies. They are the artifacts of corporate warfare. The reason JavaScript is so messy is because it was rushed in 10 days to beat Microsoft. The reason CSS is the way it is because of these battles. If you want to understand not just the syntax, but the strategy of technology, you need to go deeper. You need to understand the systems that survived. I created the HackerS blueprint for people who want to master the technology stack from the bottom up. It's not a history lesson. It's a technical arsenal. It covers Python for back-end automation, ethical hacking to understand security, which IE6 lacked, and cybersecurity protocols to understand the network layer. Understanding how the machine works gives you leverage. Understanding how the industry works gives you power. Don't just be a consumer of technology. Be a master of it. The link to the blueprint is in the description. Start building your own leverage today, because the next war is already starting, and you don't want to be on the losing side.